Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and greetings from Nebraska, where harvest is progressing well thanks to some great fall weather. Welcome to Advancing Science-Based Targets for Freshwater, the second in our fall series of webinars focused on solutions for water and food security. I'm Peter McCornick, Executive Director of the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this event, produced in partnership with the World Wildlife Fund, along with Coca-Cola, Cargill, Nestlé's, and CDP. Collectively, our food systems are by far the largest user of freshwater resources. As such, decisions in agriculture have significant repercussions on water and aquatic systems. And conversely, how we use and sustain water is crucial to our food systems. In our panel here today, we have representatives from companies and organizations who have been pioneers in improving water stewardship in agriculture and food systems. I'm very much looking forward to hearing about their recent progress, particularly on developing and achieving science-based targets. Your participation in this event is an important step to helping further develop partnerships toward viable solutions for water and food security. With that, I will turn this over to my colleague, Monica McBride, with the World Wildlife Fund to begin the webinar.
Great, thank you, Peter, and welcome to the webinar. I am Monica McBride, and I'm the Director of Agricultural and Environmental Metrics for WWF's Food and Freshwater team, and a co-lead for the Science-Based Target Network's Freshwater Hub. So today we'll be providing a very high-level introduction to the work that the Science-Based Target Network is leading on the development of methodologies for setting science-based targets for nature, and today specifically how we are working on setting science-based targets for freshwater, and how these targets fit within that larger water target landscape in which companies are already operating. We will then hear from our company representatives on how they are setting targets that incorporate the local context and the best available science in the absence of this formal methodology that is being developed for science-based targets. Next slide, please. So today I'm joined by my fellow freshwater hub co-lead, Christina Copeland from CDP, and our three panelists, Ulrike Sapiro from the Coca-Cola Company, Carlo Galli from Nestle, and Truke Smoor from Cargill. Next slide. So the three primary objectives for this webinar are to really build a broader awareness of both the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is focused on climate, and the Science-Based Target Network's role in corporate target setting. Second, to provide a deeper dive into how the Science-Based Target Network is approaching setting targets for water. And then finally, to hear examples of how leading companies are already on this journey to setting targets that incorporate both the local context and the local science. So as most of us on this call and who work in the environmental space know all too well, nature is being lost at a rate much faster than it can be restored. And therefore, immediate ambition and action is really needed by all actors to reverse this trend, both at the company level, but then also at the national and subnational level. Recent estimates from a report that WWF launched last month called the Living Planet Report showed that there has been a 68% decline in monitored populations of animals and other species since 1970. So there's really a real need right now for setting science-based targets for nature and really reversing this trend. Next slide, please. So this need for really ambitious action by all actors, but specifically the corporate sector, is what launched the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is focused on climate targets during the 2015 climate negotiations in Paris. And it was really launched when it was determined that all of the nationally determined contributions that had been submitted by countries were not enough to put the world on the path to a less than 2-degree warming by mid-century, which is what the Paris Agreement really felt was needed to mitigate the climate risks that could be coming in the second half of the century. And so as a result, a group of leading NGOs, including WWF and CDP, joined together to form the Science-Based Target Initiative to push the private sector into making commitments that could really fill this ambition gap, as you can see in the slide. And as of this week, we have over 1,000 companies who have set science-based targets for climate. So the Science-Based Target Network, which is the sister organization to SBTI, as I'll refer to it, is working to develop science-based targets for other realms, if you will, including freshwater, and is really building on this concept to drive corporate ambition to keep the world's resources, and specifically for this conversation, the freshwater resources, from reaching a tipping point, and helping to make sure that all of the contributions that are being made by corporates are helping to meet Sustainable Development Goal 6, and further are really ensuring that the current and future needs of both nature, people, and business are being met. Next slide, please. So the Science-Based Target Network is part of the larger Global Commons Alliance, which is a network of organizations, business, the world's economic systems, and to protect the global commons, which includes our freshwater systems, our land ecosystems, and our oceans. And it was formally launched in 2019, so it is only a little over a year and a half old. And the Science-Based Target Network really expands on this concept of setting targets that align with a safe operating space beyond just climate to these other issue areas such as freshwater, land, biodiversity, and oceans. So today, Christina and I represent that freshwater piece of this larger science-based target initiative. Next slide, please. So what does it really mean when we say science-based targets? So both of these platforms, SBTI and SBTN, are defining as science-based targets as those that are aligned with Earth's limits and societal sustainability goals, which in the case of climate, for example, is making sure that we are on a path to well below 2-degree warming. And so that is the science part of a science-based target. And then the targets part is making sure that these targets are measurable, actionable, and have time-bound objectives. Next slide, please. So the ultimate goal of both initiatives is to enable companies and cities to align their efforts with what the science says is needed to ensure that we are doing their part for an equitable, net zero, and nature positive future. Next slide, please. So then when thinking specifically about science-based targets for freshwater, our group has more specifically defined targets as those that align with what the current hydrological science says is needed to stay within freshwater quantity and quality thresholds of the catchments in which both the cities and the companies and their value chains operate. So the target setting for both the SBTI and SBTN are not only inclusive of a company's own operations, but also of their value chain operations. Next slide, please. So for those who are familiar with corporate target setting already, we've received the question from many about how do science-based targets for water really fit into this larger target setting landscape. So you'll see here that science-based targets for water are being seen as kind of the pinnacle of target setting for companies. And this hierarchy shows that evolution of target setting, which starts and has started traditionally with internal benchmarking and setting efficiency targets, which you'll see at the top here, and then moving more towards what we are calling contextual water targets, which focus on the right things, meaning those priority water challenges in the right places. So catchments with high water risk that are both within the company's own operations or potentially within their value chain as well. And then finally, science-based targets for water at the very bottom of this pyramid, and they will focus on water quality and quantity in the right place, and then go a step further and really look at the right level as well, meaning that these targets will incorporate what the latest local science says is needed to stay within a safe operating space for both people and nature. And then it will assign a level of responsibility to stakeholders within that catchment for how much they need to be doing to contribute to that safe operating space. Next slide, please. So how we are viewing science-based targets for water is really saying that they are a combination of the work that is already being done around private sector risk reduction and combining that with what is needed to stay within the sustainable thresholds for water at both a catchment level, but also at a global scale. So you'll see these being married here. And then the method that's being developed by the Freshwater Hub, and that will be available at the end of 2021, will build on this existing guidance that you see here referenced on the left, which is currently available today for companies to use. But it will provide that additional rigor to ensure that the targets focus on the quality and quantity thresholds based on the best available hydrological science for both surface and groundwater. And it will include that additional information on priority river basins as guidance for companies and cities, and then methods that enable users to really understand their responsibility in overcoming the challenges in each priority basin. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, the methodology will enable a company, and then eventually in the future a city, to set an enterprise-wide target that addresses the most material impacts on local freshwater resources. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that our methodology is still in development and set to be launched at the end of 2021, but in the interim, there are guidance and references out there already for companies to get started. So on September 22nd, a few weeks ago during Climate Week, the Science Based Target Network released its initial guidance that outlines a 5-step process that companies can take to set a science-based target for nature, which includes the science-based targets for water. And this guidance was produced in consultation with over 65 global organizations as part of the Global Commons Alliance from 22 different countries and included 14 different companies. And then finally, just a quick overview of what the document includes. The document outlines this 5-step process that begins with the assessment of a company or a city of their current impacts and dependencies on nature using a materiality assessment and a value chain mapping exercise. So when you put these two together, it helps you understand your full geographic scope and overall level of these impacts and dependencies, and then helps you in step 2 to understand where you need to prioritize your actions and your target setting process. And so once you've prioritized both the places where you need to set targets and also the issues upon which you need to set targets, and those issues being the freshwater, land, biodiversity, and oceans hubs of which science-based target is, the network is organized around, then step 3 is really focused on how do you measure a baseline in the location, how do you develop a monitoring plan, how do you set a target, and what types of targets do you set, and then how do you disclose this information. And so this is the step where much of the Freshwater Hub's focus over the next couple of months as we develop our first draft of the methodology, and then over the next year as we finalize it, will be touching down, since this is the key scientific step of this process. And so then once you have your targets, you enter step 4, which is really understanding, well, what can you do now to take action against these targets? And this is a modified mitigation hierarchy that starts with avoid, goes to reduce, followed by restore and regenerate, and then finally, how do you transform your business to no longer have these impacts? And so for more details on this process and for more details on each of these steps, I encourage you to download the full guidance document that is linked here in this slide. And so with that context and background, and I know that was probably a whirlwind and a very kind of 10,000-foot level, I will hand it over to Christina and our panelists to hear more about how companies are really approaching target setting for water right now in this evolving landscape.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Monica, for that great overview of what's happening both at the network level for science-based targets and then how we're working to advance that on the freshwater side. As Monica mentioned, my name is Christina Copeland. I'm the co-lead of the Freshwater Hub with her, and I'm joining from Denver, Colorado. It's great to see all of the various places around the world where we have folks listening in from. I lead CDP's water security work in the US, and CDP is an environmental nonprofit running the largest corporate disclosure and benchmarking platform on environmental issues. And I'm really thrilled to be the moderator today for the rest of our time together with 3 speakers you can see on this slide, and they're going to be bringing a really excellent perspective into setting water targets for their companies. So with that, I will pass over to Ulrike from the Coca-Cola Company to introduce both yourself as well as the water targets that you are working on within your company.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Monica. I hope you can see and hear me, at least hear me. That's, I think, the main thing. And I see you have put up a slide. So we've been asked to put together a slide for each company to briefly talk about our current or forward-looking water strategies, which I want to do for the Coca-Cola Company. I think Monica, as she closed her talk, said it is a very evolving landscape. And I think the presentation on science-based targets really shows how exciting and evolving that is. So I think I want to immediately make a little disclaimer about the slide, which is I feel that because it's so evolving and because science-based targets are part of the process, as we have just seen, with a number of steps that have to be taken along the road, a water strategy is not anymore set in stone. So if I'm sharing with you today where we stand today and where I believe we need to go in the next 10 years, I don't believe the same slide will come up in 3 months' time or even 6 months' time. We will be evolving this, we will be shaping this, we will have to adapt it to, as we go along the process that we've just seen around the prioritization, the target setting, the baselining, how we actually shape our articulation of what we want to achieve. So I give that little health warning that this is where we are today, looking from here forward, but knowing that this will probably be adapted. The other thing is looking backwards. Of course, none of the companies here on this call and others are starting with water from scratch. So we're all building on a legacy of work that we've done so far and that we're evolving further in the understanding and how our businesses are evolving and our learning and our data is evolving. So with that little intro, I just want to maybe share a few words around the slide. I'm not going to go into all the details, but essentially the next 10 years for us, we have been building on the work we've done on replenishment, efficiency, advocacy and access to water for communities to shape what we call the Water for Life strategy on water, which is identified as, or we have shaped or framed it as availability of water, good quality of water, access of water to everybody, and good governance. And our global vision, that's the uppermost part, is what is the vision, the outcome we want to drive, then the key activities and action we're going to take, and then how are we going to do this? The transversal priority levers for change of how are we going to actually implement that. So if I go from the top to the bottom, the vision overall is that we want to achieve increased water security where we operate, where we source ingredients, and where we touch people's lives. And that means specifically where we operate to reduce local shared water challenges, where we're dependent on watersheds to improve watershed health overall and achieve a sustainable supply chain, and in the communities that we operate in to enhance community water resilience with a particular focus on women and girls. The activities that hang below those are manifold because, as you've seen, science-based means more complexity, but also more impact. And I just want to outline a couple of things. So on the operations, we'll continue, of course, to build on the efficiency, wastewater treatment and risk management work in all facilities globally. All nearly 900 of them will have to continue driving improvement in that space. We're particularly also calling out that we align with the AWS, Alliance for Water Stewardship Principles. But more importantly, we will prioritize leadership locations, which are operating both in higher stress context, but also have a particular opportunity to drive change. And we want them to achieve what we call regenerative water use. This is a concept that has come in different words, up in different contexts, but regenerative water use is basically a combination of reducing, reusing, recycling, and replenishment of water in the local context. And I think there's more that we can say to that at another point. In the watersheds, we will continue to aim our 100% global replenishment goal. It's something we've achieved for the last 5 years. To globally balance basically our direct water use. We'll continue with that, but we want to put that now into more of a watershed health context. So that in priority watersheds, both for sourcing and operating, we want to put replenishment into the service of watershed health by working really on quantity, quality, ecosystem health, infrastructure and governance. So putting it into this bigger concept, both for operating and sourcing watersheds. And finally, communities, again, we're building on the work we've done with 10.6 million people to provide access to water and sanitation globally. We will continue working on access to wash, but we also will work with more communities around adaptation to climate change. Even in areas where wash is currently not a problem, in the future, there will be challenges around adaptation around water in communities, and also work around the Wash for Work framework and bring that into our game. Final word, it's not only important, I believe, in the future what you do, but also how you do it. And that's why we're calling out advocacy, collective action, and reporting and disclosure as part of the key levers for change. And we will go forward and report against those regularly and make them really part of the strategy going forward. And I hand over to Carlo with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrike, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone joining. Thanks, Monica, Christine, and Peter for the invitation. As for Ulrike, on my side, I have prepared a very quick one slide to take you through quickly the key commitments we have in the water stewardship landscape. I would start by sharing the comments made by Ulrike on the fact that the water stewardship landscape is moving very fast, as it will be for the commitments to reflect the way companies our size are tackling this emerging issues, especially for us, because probably you know most of our commitments were set for 2020, so we are currently in a phase of elaboration for post-2020 sustainability commitments. We have a flagship initiative at Nestle. We call it Caring for Water, which embeds whatever we are doing in the water domain. We have key impact areas for actually factories, watersheds, agriculture supply chain, and communities. So we have many commitments. The three I have decided to share with you in this one slide are those who are somehow helping to understand what is also the evolution of a business in the water stewardship journey, moving from inside to outside focus, and from an internal, a unilateral approach into collective action. So water use efficiency, the target we set already a few years ago, was more to continue in the leadership journey in water use efficiency within our factories. I think this is very much to target the dependency issue we have in our factories. So the less you use water, the less you are dependent on water. I think this is also serving, this is the expectation, the hope, as an inspirational factor for other local water users to also become responsible in the way they use this precious resource. I have to say there is quite a number of lessons we have learned in this long journey. We have delivered a lot, but at the end of the day, this is not necessarily changing in many places the exposure to risks related to water resource management. We are very much going into a more laser-focused targeting for internal water use efficiency, which is more what we call context-based approach. We have where it matters factories, which are defined based on the exposure level to water-related risks. But the real transition is to understand that you work on dependency, but you do not work on resilience of your business when you only target factory savings. It's pretty much straightforward for many of us who went into this evolution years ago. Maybe for less mature organizations, this is also a reality they should start facing since the very beginning. So when you move to the other level, you go external. What we are doing is using the Alliance Water Stewardship Standard as a guidance. We have committed already a few years ago to certify all our bottled water factories with the Alliance Water Stewardship Standard. That does not stop there, because we have already many other food and beverage factories in our operations already certified wherever it matters. Maybe for bottled water, we have more opportunities to engage in this journey everywhere. This is why we committed in every factory. For food factories, I think we rather go more for where it matters. So especially where we are more exposed to water risks, because at the end of the day, the concept is that you try to understand what are the local challenge and find solutions which are not unilateral solutions, but these solutions working with your neighbors. The certification for us is also very important because it gives more credibility to what we are doing, because we are audited on the outcomes of our activities, and we are measured in our actions. The last one is what we have committed recently on replenish. Maybe this is the last one, temporarily speaking. That does not mean we were not doing it before. Even I would say that when we look at replenish, it's rather more a link between factory savings, so the responsibility part of water stewardship, and the Alliance Water Stewardship approach, which is more the sustainability approach. So the replenishment, at least I give you my personal perspective, is how a company, a factory would unilaterally approach the responsible side of managing water resources locally. The benchmark, the volumetric benchmark, would simply mean having a measurable target, in any case, aimed at delivering locally a set of water stewardship initiatives which would contribute towards this collective action. So these are the three areas, from inside to outside, and looking from a factory compound into a watershed dimension. And probably during the panel session, we will discuss also what are the issues and the opportunities related to this approach, which is in many aspects going back to the difficulty we have in certain places to set science-based targets.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carlo. And I think we pass over to Truke now from Cargill.
Yes, thank you for the organizing committee, and thank you for the large audience for joining us here today. I'm Truke Smoor. I'm the Global Sustainability Director for Water at Cargill. So at Cargill, our purpose is to nourish the world in a safe, responsible, and sustainable way. And we are building on 155 years of experience. And what we do is we connect farmers and producers and rangers with our customers through food processing and food ingredients. And as you've seen in the first part of the presentation, like, the world faces extraordinary challenges, and water is one of them. And at Cargill, we believe we have a leadership role to play to develop and accelerate solutions across our value chain, especially looking into agricultural solutions. A widely cited number is that 70% of the water use is associated with agriculture, and it makes it critical to include the agricultural supply chain into our scope of work. And to reflect all these points, we worked over the past months to update our water strategy, and we launched our new water targets in July this year. And these targets really have been developed in close collaboration with the World Resources Institute and build on this best available global data sets, but also the guidances that were mentioned, especially the ones on setting water targets in a catchment context, but also the enterprise-wide target setting. And I think the ones that I want to highlight here as part of the introduction is the importance of looking across that value chain and focusing on where it is needed most and where you can drive the change. So these targets, they reflect the severity of the water challenges, but also how they are recognized in the community and the watersheds, and what is our contribution to it, not only from the regions where we operate, but also from the regions that we source from. So we are looking both at our agricultural supply chain and our operations. So when you look at these numbers, you see you see a lot of big numbers, like restoring the 600 billion liters of water, reducing 5 million kilograms of pollutants. But underlying these big numbers, there are individual watershed targets. So what we have done is mapping our operations and supply chains against these identified issues, and then looking at zooming into where are the specific water challenges an issue and how can we drive the change that is needed there. And so under this, we have over 100 targets for each of these individual watersheds, and together they form our global ambition to achieve sustainable water management in our operations and all our priority watersheds by 2030. So we see agriculture as a very powerful way to advance water stewardship, but to reduce emissions, but also ensuring a safe and responsible and sustainable food system.
Great. Thank you very much, all of you, for giving that great overview of the work that you are implementing at each of your companies. And now we're going to have a bit of a discussion. To start out, I would like to hear, I mean, I think we got a bit of a sense from this, or a pretty good sense from your slides, but in terms of thinking about how your company has worked to integrate the principles of science-based target into your existing water stewardship work. And I might start with Carlo on this, and specifically, Carlo, one of the questions we've already gotten in the chat from the audience is, what do you mean by replenish 100% of the water used? So if you can speak to that as well, potentially if there's any sort of scientific backing in how you're measuring that or tracking that, and then just broadly how the principles of science-based targets are integrated into your work.
Yes, sorry, I only heard bits and pieces of your question, but I understand that in general you wanted to know how we address our embed context-based approach into our targets, and also you wanted to know more about the replenish commitment, right?
Yes, that's right, and not just contextual, but also science-based principles.
Yeah, well, the point is exactly, you displayed the slide for targets moving from contextual into science-based. I think in many places we are still stuck on the availability of science. And because in many places there's not enough science to understand fully the balance, the hydrogeological balance locally. So how to make it sustainable if this is unsustainable? What is the shared use of water resources? There's also lack on governance mechanisms to drive all that. So in many places we would rather be more contextual rather than science-based today. With the Alliance Water Stewardship Standard, in any case, what we do, and we used to do it even before, we try to build knowledge where the knowledge is not available. So we always go through, and it's a requirement everywhere, full-fledged hydrogeological studies when we use groundwater resources. So we know rather well the level of availability and the risks related to water resources management locally. I think the issue is when you have to understand this picture at the broader catchment level. This is where probably a company alone cannot do this whole exercise. So in a nutshell, I would say that we are trying to address as much as we can science-based targets to the limit, to the extent science is available locally. Connection with the replenish target, I don't think this is the first time you hear about replenishment. This is an approach taken by many other companies. What we are currently doing, we have done together with other parties, we have tried to, first of all, develop a methodology. You probably heard about this water volumetric accounting methodology. Is an open source, is a peer-reviewed methodology, so that we at least try to apply rules that are agreed in the international space and validated by a set of credible parties. So the replenish is somehow to be seen as an approach to implement, together with other actors locally, a set of initiatives within the watershed to compensate the withdrawal you have at the factory level. Is it enough? Probably not in many places, because probably the threat to local water resources goes beyond the amount of water we use, because in many places we are a very small user. So that's why for me it's very important to move into the AWS mindset, which is allowing discussion and action together. Sometimes it's not easy to have science-based targets, but what is very important is not wasting any second and start acting with others, doing something and waiting for maybe more science to come, and then to set up a more a structured approach at the watershed level.
Great, thank you. And yes, couldn't agree more. The need for swift action definitely overcomes waiting for all of the science that might be needed. Truke, I would love to hear your perspective on this as well, and maybe a bit more information on what science you were integrating into the target that you shared.
Yes, and happy to highlight kind of a little bit of our journey of where we went, because indeed in the past we came from having those global efficiency goals, but realized that this really kind of embraced it as an opportunity to look at how can we really drive the change that is needed, but also address those critical areas that we see. And actually, like by following the enterprise-wide target setting guidance, the first step there, and I think that really aligns with the science-based target guidance, is saying, well, assess the materiality and the impact in the value chain. So that was our first step that we followed. And out of that analysis, you clearly see as well, the largest impact is in the supply chain, as it would be for, I would believe, any company in the food sector. And so that made us focus to say, like, let's focus on the agricultural supply chain, but then also let's make sure that we keep our own house in order and include our operations into it. And then the next step in the framework, it's about interpretation and prioritization. That's also was looking at, like, well, what are the shared water challenges that we want to focus on? Doing on one hand justice to the local context in which water needs to be addressed, and then looking at, well, where is water availability an issue? Where is water quality an issue? Where is access to safe drinking water an issue? Because we believe that all three are fundamental, and it's very important to not only focus on water scarcity and water availability, but really look at the holistic landscape that's associated with water. And so we mapped our operational footprint, but also our supply chain footprint, like the crops that we source and the regions that we grow. And out of that, we defined our priority watersheds. And then the first step is really like determining our contribution to it. Like, what is the associated footprint in those priority watersheds, and what's the desired change that is needed? And by applying that simple equation of saying, like, well, what is the desired change and what is our contribution to it, we arrived at that point of being able to identify the targets based on the best available science to and then sum them all up to arrive at the numbers that you saw on the slide that was shared. So that's really building on those first three principles that were highlighted in the science-based target network.
And speaking of the principles that were coming through in the slide around science-based targets, I saw one question. I noticed in the graphic that one option for response was avoid. Under what circumstances is it better to avoid than engage? And just wanted to clarify there, what avoid means is thinking about, should you avoid, for example, using a certain dangerous chemical in your operations, or avoid operating in a certain place with high biological diversity. So that's what is meant by the avoid there. I'm going to pass over to Ulrike now, and certainly welcome thoughts from you on incorporating principles of science-based targets into your water stewardship work, but also I'm going to give you a second question, acknowledging that we have a lot of research and academic folks on the line. Would love to hear from you what you need from the researchers and academic community to support setting and achieving goals.
Right. Okay, I hope you have your pencils sharpened. That's a good question. Well, I think before we get into the specifics, I'd really like to recognize that the context, really the context in which we are having this conversation, not so much that we're all on screen, but really in terms of historical level of maturity of the conversation. I think COVID in itself has probably heightened that, but the climate discussion, resilience discussion, all that I think has led to a real sense of urgency and understanding of the multiple nexuses that water is connected into, and how that now also very much is quantifiably impacting business, right? So the heightened sense of business, of systems risk and impact, I think is something that really has increased significantly in the last few months and years. And I really think we are in this watershed moment where we see a convergence of both science and scientific data availability. I know, Carlo, you mentioned there's still a lot missing, but I think we've never been in a better place about knowing where we have to focus and how to prioritize our actions and what we need to look at, but also a convergence of corporate commitment to drive impact beyond just, you know, balancing out your own numbers, but to really actually make a systems difference and to do that with collective action. And so if I make an example, I think a few years ago, we had so often these conversations that sort of ended with these questions that said, how can we work better together? How can we know where we should be working together? How do we know what impact we're going to make? And this was always a circular, really a circular conversation. And I feel now we are in a place that is significantly different, that is asking, how can we do things better? How can we actually drive more impact? How can we, you know, it's about semantics, about whether it's context-based targets or whether it's science-based targets and whether that gets us further. I think we now have different tools and different data and understanding available to actually get us to a new place. So I just wanted to recognize a bit that context, the sort of new quality of discussion. And what I particularly like about the science-based targets initiative approach is, as first and foremost, it's embedding water with the other big systems and natural systems, and so puts it in that context where it has to be. I think it felt very often that water was a bit sitting on the sidelines, and I think being part of that is a very important achievement. Secondly, I think achieving that first dimension of designing a process along which you are, you know, going to put prioritization and target setting on a context basis and reporting and implementation together, I think is extremely helpful to bring more companies along. But it's only, I think, the first dimension. What's then really, I think, important, and that's where we come now to science and academia. We need to map the existing data, the existing tools, the existing levels of insight into that process. Because I think what we shouldn't be doing is starting a multiplication of efforts and new tools and new things that just cause confusion. Because if the more, you know, heat we create by having more confusion, the less light we have by through getting action. So really mapping existing tools and insights and data into that process. How can that, what we have already, can help us actually achieve what we're set out to do? That's the second, for me, dimension that should come. The third dimension is help us to understand, and water is probably the most difficult way of, or resource to do that in. What is good enough? Right? What is your fair share? On climate, on carbon, you sort of can do this. On water, it's incredibly difficult, but I think we all want to strive for that impact and for doing the right thing. So help us define what is that science-based level of ambition we have to set. And that, for me, is the third dimension. And I think that's very much a discussion we're going to have. And the fourth, if I may, is help us really to be able to do better baseline quantification of what is the baseline that we are, what is the impacts that we can drive, who is benefiting from that, how can we actually translate that into value for nature, for people, and for business, and to help us understand what's enough. So I think these four dimensions is what the opportunity is, and where science and academia is really all over it and all across it in its role. But the big responsibility it also has, as a closing shot, is it has to be actionable. Right? I think the biggest tension is between the organizations have to implement and action things and the ones who are defining the tools and the data. It has to be really practical. And I think that's a big challenge as well. Handing it back to you, Christina.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think those are all great points, and specifically, you know, not reinventing the wheel. We do have so many resources and scientific information available, and we need to have them all engaged in collective action to bring it together. I'm going to take a few more questions that are coming through the chat. And Carlo, I would be interested to hear from you and also any of the other speakers. What stakeholders are you integrating into your assessing, planning, and ultimately target setting? What does the diversity of this representation look like internally and externally?
So in terms of what are the stakeholders, typically when you work with the AWS mindset, there is no predefined stakeholder that you are targeting. Normally, first step is in the stakeholder mapping. Wherever you have a factory or an operation, you want to understand who are your neighbors. So we go through a stakeholder mapping exercise, and we try to understand, using methodology that is widely available, who are those who are the most relevant in terms of influence, in terms of interest, in terms of shared challenge. So there's no real answer to that. You have to go through a local assessment, and the level of the type of issues, the type of stakeholders, and the type of challenge would be different place to place. When we are dealing from a methodological standpoint on the replenishment journey, I think this is somehow an addendum to the methodology that has been built, is trying to fix rules on what are the criteria to take decisions. Because, you know, setting a target on replenish water everywhere, you may not even find the project locally. You may find the project, you don't find the collaborative approach by stakeholders who should be, you know, critical to deploy this project. So at the end, you need to also fix somehow exit strategy when in the proximity of the factory, you do not have necessarily a replenish solution, or you do not have the level of needed engagement by stakeholders. So whatever the decision will be, for example, to move from a immediate proximity of the factory into a broader catchment, the rules and the criteria to be used will be applied consulting local stakeholders, because in principle, this is not a decision you have to take unilaterally, because you may say, I didn't find a project, but have you consulted stakeholders? So this would be the first rule. And then any decision to be validated by key credible third parties. This could also be very relevant stakeholders in the governance setup. So I'm not sure if I answered to your question, but these are the couple of thoughts that came to my mind.
Thank you. Yeah, it sounds like it's extremely grounded in the local actors. So through that and through the AWS approach, you know, there is then the fact that if you are truly grounding it in local actors, that you are getting a good diverse group of folks who should be in the room. We have about 3 to 4 minutes left before I pass over to Monica for some closing words, and a lot of fantastic questions coming in from the audience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give each of our panelists one question and 1 minute to answer it. And I'm going to start with Truke. There's a question, is part of Cargill's strategy to work with agricultural producers? And if so, how are you engaging with and educating producers in practice to help advance Cargill's corporate goals? 1 minute.
The 2-second answer to that is yes, we are planning to work with definitely with our agricultural partners. So we see linking up with actors across the entire supply chain is critical to ensure solutions work for all. And so an example is the NEO 5-year project we launched recently together with the Nature Conservancy, McDonald's and Targets to support Nebraska farmers to advance and scale up soil health practices. And I think it's critical that like these programs allow others to really contribute to it, but also that they are adaptive enough to make it work for all stakeholders. And so what you see here is that we're engaging both with the farmers, but also with our customers to find solutions that make those connecting points and that provide not only a water benefit, but also a greenhouse gas benefit and contribute to the resilience of the farmers that are part of this.
Fantastic, thank you. Ulrike, I'm going to ask you to answer a question that we've gotten about the COVID-19 pandemic and if that has impacted on water sources at the local and global scale, or if it has affected how you're thinking about your water strategy?
Well, the COVID pandemic obviously is, and it has to, I don't think we can use the past tense in this case yet, by any means, is hugely disruptive, and we'll see more of that. Our sustainability strategies, on the other hand, are very long-term, and we have an eye on the long-term and the transformational change we want to drive. So nothing is changing in the vision that we want to drive. But of course, we have to adapt to the short-term realities of restrictions of movement, but also the new opportunities or the clear opportunities in supporting communities. I think all the companies broadly are looking for opportunities for how they can leverage their existing work to really respond to the challenges of COVID in communities. So be it sanitizing equipment, hygiene equipment, or in our case, we have really accelerated some of our access to water programs and worked with our partners to do more of that, or attach hygiene education into the program. So a lot of opportunities there, and clearly a way to address those. But I think we haven't seen the end of it yet. But where we all, I think, have a role to play is to make sure that the changes that we see coming because of COVID on a systemic level are going to be lasting. So the new better, building back better is really the important piece here that we want to support and make sure we're on a better path coming out of it.
Absolutely, thank you. Building back better, not just a green economy, but a blue economy.
That's right.
Okay, final question going to Carlo for 1 minute. Could you speak to the economic impacts of the sustainability targets? Are the costs passed on to consumers, and how willing are consumers to pay for their part in promoting sustainability?
Yeah, maybe very quick thought on that. I'm not sure we need to charge consumer on the costs for sustainability. At our level, we are currently thinking about our other internal mechanisms to fund sustainability roadmaps. I think also there's a great opportunity currently, because many of the big organizations, they are also going, as we do, into the net zero greenhouse gas emission pledge. These roadmaps are currently built on the amount of carbon you can sequester. But for a food and beverage company like we are, the majority of the footprint, the greenhouse gas emission footprint, is in the ingredients, is in the agricultural supply chain, is in areas like nature-based solutions and regenerative agriculture. So there we have really unquantified, untapped opportunities for water stewardship to a cost that probably is already budgeted in the climate roadmap.
Great, thank you. Good to hear about the interconnections between the climate and water work. Okay, well, thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives and the information on your targets. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I am going to, in the interest of time, pass it back over to Monica very quickly to wrap us up.
Great, thank you, Christina. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of kind of what's next for the Freshwater Hub. And so you'll see here that we are currently, as I mentioned before, in the methodology development process and are aiming to have our first, what we are calling deployable methodology, ready by the end of this year, at which time we will be both doing some in-field testing and also doing additional reviews with external experts to incorporate that feedback by the end of 2021. And then this method will eventually be integrated into the larger science-based target network guidance that is currently set to be released by the end of 2022. So with that, I also wanted to say thank you to our exceptional speakers for sharing all of your expertise with us today. And again, you will find more information about the DWFI and their work to ensure water and food security on their website, which is at thewaterforfood.nebraska.edu. And you can connect with them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And thank you all, and have a great rest of your day and rest of your week.